Hello, and welcome back to Speak More Fluently.
Great to be here.
Today we're tackling something that, well, it can really make or break your English conversations.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's how to express agreement and disagreement smoothly,
Yeah.
respectfully.
Ah, yes. It's a big one.
Ever felt like you had a great point, but maybe stumbled trying to share it politely?
Yeah.
Or worried about causing offense when you just don't see eye to eye?
Happens all the time.
Well, stick around, because we're going to unpack some really practical ways to handle these moments with confidence. The idea is to help you build stronger connections and really make your voice heard wherever you're speaking English.
That's exactly right. I mean,
Right.
think about it whether you're in like a lively debate, a work meeting, or just chatting with friends.
Yeah.
Being able to agree and disagree thoughtfully is just, well, it's key. It's often not just what you say, but how you say it. That makes all the difference, really.
Okay, so let's dig into that. Why is being polite so incredibly crucial when we're agreeing or disagreeing?
Yeah.
It feels kind of obvious, but what's the deeper impact?
Well, fundamentally, politeness builds rapport. It fosters a sense of respect, makes people feel heard.
Right.
When you approach a conversation politely, you're basically signaling, hey, I value your perspective, even if it's different from mine.
That makes sense. It creates a better atmosphere right away.
Precisely. It just makes the space more comfortable for open communication. And think of it like laying down a foundation of mutual understanding first.
So it's more than just having good manners. It actually helps the conversation move in a positive direction.
Exactly. And think about disagreement specifically. When you express a different opinion with tact, you really lower the chances of things getting heated or turning into a conflict.
Softening the language helps.
Definitely. It allows people to actually hear your point without feeling attacked or, dismissed. Plus, clear, polite communication actually makes things clearer overall.
How so?
When your delivery is considerate, the listener is more likely to focus on the substance, on your actual idea, rather than getting sort of defensive about the tone.
It's almost like politeness acts as a bridge then, connecting different viewpoints instead of just building walls between them.
That's a great way to put it. A bridge. Yeah.
Now, we often hear that English speakers, particularly in some cultures, value a certain level of indirectness. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Absolutely. In many English-speaking cultures, though not all, it varies. There's often an emphasis on maintaining harmony, avoiding direct confrontation.
Okay.
So being aware of that and using polite indirectness can be really beneficial. It helps you navigate conversations effectively and, frankly, shows cultural sensitivity. It's about being considerate of how your words might land.
Okay, so politeness is the groundwork. What are some core ways we can actually put this into practice? Some key principles for when we're agreeing or disagreeing?
Right. Well, one really effective tool is using what linguists call hedging language.
Hedging. Like a hedge in a garden.
Sort of. Think of these as little verbal softeners. They signal that you're open to other ideas, that you're not presenting your opinion as, like, the absolute final truth.
Okay, I think I get it. Can you give us some concrete examples? What does hedging actually sound like?
Certainly. You might say things like, I'm not entirely sure, but, or maybe, it seems to me that,
Uh-huh.
or even framing it as a suggestion, like, perhaps we could consider. These phrases subtly show you're offering a perspective, not laying down the law.
So it feels less like you're shutting down the discussion and more like you're inviting more thought. Okay. What's another key strategy?
Another crucial one is starting with a positive or some kind of acknowledgement, especially before you disagree.
Right. Acknowledge before you counter. How might we do that naturally?
You could start with something simple like, that's an interesting point, or I see what you mean about, even just, you make a good case for. Works well. It shows you've actually listened. You've considered their idea. That's inherently respectful, right? And it can make them more open to hearing your view afterwards.
Yeah, it's like saying, okay, I've heard you, I've processed that, and now here's my take. What about formality? Does how formal or informal we are play into this?
Oh, definitely. Huge role. The level of formality should really match the situation and, who you're talking to.
Makes sense.
So in more formal settings, think work meetings, presentations, you'll generally want to use polite modal verbs like could, would, might, and stick to more complete sentences.
Okay. And how does that change if it's just a casual chat, say, with friends?
Much more flexibility there. Contractions like I'd, you're, can't are perfectly fine. And you might use more casual agreement phrases like, yeah, that's cool, or totally. It's all about adapting to the context.
Right, reading the room. Okay, we've got some good principles down. Now let's get practical.
Yeah.
What are some specific things we can actually say to agree politely in English?
Well, for simple agreement, you can't go wrong with the basics. I agree, that's right, or exactly, clear, direct, polite.
Easy enough. What if we really strongly agree with someone? How do we amp it up a bit?
Good question. When you feel that strong alignment, you can use phrases like, I couldn't agree more, or absolutely, or maybe, that's exactly how I feel. These add real emphasis.
Got it. And what if we agree, but we also want to add our own point, build on what they said?
Ah, yes. You can do that smoothly too. Try things like, I agree, and I'd also add that. Or that's true, plus. Or even, yes, and another thing is, these let you contribute more without just repeating or taking away from their original point.
That's really useful. Sometimes just showing you're following along before you actually agree can help too, right? Like little nards in the conversation.
Absolutely. Using short, active listening responses, things like, I see, or that makes sense, or even a simple, right, they show you're engaged. You're processing it.
Keeps the flow going.
Exactly. These little cues maintain the flow and signal you're on board before you maybe offer your full agreement.
Okay, now for the trickier bit. Disagreeing politely. How do we express a different view without, causing friction or awkwardness?
Right, the delicate art of disagreement. Well, one starting point is to use phrases that gently introduce the fact you see things differently. Things like, I'm not sure I completely agree, or I have a slightly different take on that, or maybe I'm not entirely convinced that. These signal a difference of opinion, but softly, non-confrontationally.
So it's about easing into it, not just jumping in with, no, you're wrong.
Exactly. Avoid that if possible. Another constructive approach is offering an alternative idea.
How does that work?
Instead of just knocking down their idea, you suggest another path. You might say, perhaps another way to think about it is, or have you considered, or one possibility could be. It frames your disagreement as exploring options.
That feels more collaborative. Now, I've heard people talk about the agree and disagree approach. Can you explain that?
Yes, that's a really valuable technique, super useful. The core idea is, first, find something you can agree on in what the other person said. Acknowledge that first.
Okay.
And then state your differing view. So, for instance, I agree with you up to a point, but, or, you're right about X, however, I wonder about Y. Or, I can definitely see why you think that, but from my perspective. It shows you're not just dismissing their whole point out of hand.
That sounds like a really balanced way to do it, finding common ground even when you disagree. We also mentioned modal verbs could, would, might for general politeness earlier. How do they help specifically with disagreeing?
They're fantastic for softening disagreements. So instead of a blunt, that won't work, you could try, I could be wrong, but I'm not sure if that approach would work here. Or asking questions like, would it be possible to explore another option? Or might it make sense if we... Using these modals just adds a layer of sort of tentativeness and politeness. Makes the disagreement much easier to hear.
Takes the sharp edge off.
I got it.
Now, obviously, it's not just the words we pick, is it? Our nonverbal communication must be pretty important, too.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Your facial expressions, your eye contact, they speak volumes. Nodding while someone speaks shows you're listening, you're engaged. A little smile can soften your words, especially if you're about to disagree gently. And sometimes, like, raised eyebrows can signal polite curiosity or maybe a touch of doubt rather than outright rejection.
Okay, interesting. What about our voice itself, the way we actually sound?
Hugely important. Your tone and intonation can completely change how a message lands. For example, if you're offering a mild disagreement, maybe letting your voice go up slightly at the end.
Like a question.
Almost, yeah. It can invite more discussion, makes it sound less like a final verdict. Whereas a lower, steadier tone might convey firmer agreement or emphasize a point you feel strongly about. And don't forget the power of the pause.
The pause.
Yeah, just taking a brief pause before you jump in, especially to disagree. It gives you a second to choose your words carefully, politely, shows consideration.
That's a great tip. A well-placed pause. And beyond the face and voice, what about, the rest of our body language?
Also contributes. Leaning in just slightly can signal interest. Keeping an open posture, arms uncrossed, for example, makes you seem more approachable, more open to the conversation. Even small gestures, like using open palm gestures sometimes when you're explaining a different view, can help soften the disagreement, makes you seem less closed off.
We touched on cultural stuff earlier. Could you give us maybe a couple more specific examples? How might politeness look different in, say, the U.S. versus the U.K.?
Sure. And again, these are generalizations, but useful ones. In the US, you might find directness is often more common and accepted as long as the overall tone is polite.
Okay.
In the UK, traditionally, there's often a greater emphasis on understatement, using more hedging, more indirectness to express disagreement.
Yeah.
And maybe somewhere like Australia or New Zealand, you might find a bit more informality, perhaps using humor sometimes to navigate disagreements.
Interesting how it varies. So if we're talking to someone and we're just not sure about their cultural background or preferred style, what's a good rule of thumb?
That's a common situation. A really good strategy is just to observe and adapt. Pay attention to how they express agreement and disagreement.
Mirror them a bit.
Exactly. Try to roughly match their level of formality and directness. It shows you're paying attention, you're sensitive to their style, and it generally helps build rapport faster.
Good advice. Okay, finally, are there any common traps or mistakes people fall into when they're trying to be polite in agreeing or disagreeing? Things we should actively avoid.
Yes, definitely a few pitfalls. One is just overusing the word no. A blunt no can sound really abrupt, even rude sometimes.
Right.
It's usually much better to use softer alternatives we talked about, like, I'm not so sure about that, or, well, actually, or I'm afraid I see it differently.
Okay, soften the no. What else?
Interrupting, it's a big one. Even if you're excited to jump in, try to wait for a natural pause. It just shows respect for the speaker.
Good reminder. Anything else?
And be mindful of slang. What's perfectly fine with your close friends saying no or nope might sound unprofessional or disrespectful in a more formal setting like a business meeting. Context is key.
Absolutely. Wow, this has been incredibly insightful. So just to quickly recap the main points for everyone listening.
Yeah, let's do that.
We've talked about why politeness is so important, building rapport, avoiding conflict, ensuring clarity. We covered key tools like hedging language and acknowledging the other person's point first.
Right, and matching your formality to the situation.
Exactly. Then we got into specific phrases for agreeing from simple to strong and how to add information. And of course, lots of ways to disagree politely. Softening, offering alternatives, the agree and disagree technique, using those helpful modal verbs.
Don't forget nonverbals, tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, they all play a huge role.
Crucial. And being aware of cultural differences and trying to avoid common mistakes like interrupting or using the wrong level of formality.
That's a pretty good summary. Mastering these elements really can significantly enhance how effectively you communicate and connect with people in English.
Definitely. So for all of you listening, here's a little challenge or maybe just something to think about. In your next English conversations, try to actively notice how people around you handle agreement and disagreement.
Become an observer.
Yeah. Pay attention to the specific words they use, their tone, their body language. And then maybe experiment a little. Try consciously using one or two of the phrases or techniques we discussed today.
See how it feels, how it changes the dynamic.
Exactly. See how it impacts your interactions, the connections you make. Because remember, getting really fluent and effective in communication, it's an ongoing journey, isn't it? It's about constant observation and practice.
Well said.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive on Speak More Fluently.